Reborn. The first thing I did was rush back home in my previous life. During the housing reform year, Ryan secretly gave the savings we had worked hard to save for 2 years to Elena just to give her a home. Over the next decade, housing prices skyrocketed and Elena became a wealthy woman admired by everyone. As for me, I was stuck living in a cramped 30-square-meter-old flat. After being laid off early, I struggled day and night selling street food to support my family. The day I collapsed, Ryan was traveling across the country with Elena. Chapter 1. Laura. Congratulations. I heard your family is getting a 3-bedroom apartment this time. TSK. TSK. Laura is so lucky. She's got a house and is marrying a teacher too. TSK. TSK. I closed the courtyard door amidst the murmurs of envy and jealousy. Once inside, I headed straight to Ryan's bedroom, taking a deep breath. I shakily pulled open the desk drawer in a square, iron mooncake tin. I saw my stash of money still sitting there. I counted it, no more, no less. Just over 900 yuan in my previous life. Elena used this money to buy a house and achieve financial freedom a decade later. But I am bolder than her this time. I plan to take this money and head south. Ryan and I were supposed to get married next month, on the 18th of the lunar calendar. But in this life, that wedding is never going to happen. I secured the money close to me and was about to leave when I heard voices outside the door. Startled, I quickly returned to my own room. Chapter 2. Brother Ryan. Are you really giving me your housing quota? The woman's voice was clear and full of disbelief and joy. Even I was stunned when I heard it. I only knew in my past life that Elena bought the house with Ryan's money. I didn't realize he had even given her his housing quota. My eyes reddened, and I bit my lip hard. You and Lucas are living under someone else's roof. You need this house more than I do. Ryan's voice was gentle, completely different from the indifferent tone he used with me. I listened as Elena thanked him profusely. Then she hesitated and said, "But even with the quota, I'm afraid I can't afford it." Ryan didn't respond. Brother Ryan. You know, Lucas is still young and expensive to raise. I can't save much from my part-time jobs. After a moment of silence, Ryan finally spoke. I'll figure out the money. Elena tried to refuse a few times before the two of them finally left. I only came out of my room after they were gone. I remember in my previous life, when I heard Elena had made millions from the house she bought back then. I envied her so much, and what did Ryan say at the time? He simply ate his meal without looking up and said, "It's fate if it's not meant for you. There's no point thinking about it." I completely believed him back then. I really thought Elena was just incredibly lucky. Little did I know that the so-called luck came from Ryan draining me dry to give it to her in my past life. If Elena hadn't slipped up and mentioned how grateful she was for Ryan's help in buying that house, I would have died never knowing the truth. How deep must his love for her have been to let me and her child squeeze into a 30-square-meter flat, also he could give Elena the money and the house. And then tell me it was fate? Thinking about it now, Chapter 3. After the two of them left, I sat quietly in the room for half the day. By evening, I went to Ryan's room, took out the mooncake tin, and placed it on the dining table. Chapter 4. That night, I cooked a chicken stew and steamed a big pot of rice for myself. After finishing the meal, I opened the lid of the mooncake tin. Inside, apart from my savings of over 1,000 yuan, there was also Ryan's salary from the past 2 years. It totaled exactly 2,600 yuan. In addition, there was the housing certificate issued by his workplace and some receipts for daily purchases. When Ryan returned and saw the open tin, he frowned. Chapter 5. Ryan and I had known each other for a long time. Around here, once you're engaged, it's practically the same as being family. It wasn't unusual for us to share responsibilities, and no one would question it. That's why I had trusted him enough to keep my savings with him. Who would have thought Ryan was scheming behind my back, not only thinking about Elena, but also giving her both our salaries and the housing quota? He ruined my entire life. Chapter 6. Why did you take the tin out? He frowned, looking at me unhappily. In the past, I would have already greeted him at the door. Ryan was handsome and well-mannered. After graduating from university, he worked at a research institute. I had once been very satisfied with this fiancé, even giving him my whole heart. But I was wrong. I just found out today that my father borrowed some money from his colleagues. I planned to use this to pay them back first. My mother passed away early. My father was a middle school teacher. He was always dedicated to his job and treated his students with care. Ryan had been one of my father's students back then. Ryan's family struggled financially, so my father not only tutored him for free, but also secretly gave him pocket money several times. Even some of his high school tuition fees were covered by my father. Ryan wasn't the only student my father helped, so despite being a teacher for a lifetime, my father hadn't saved much. Sometimes, he even had to borrow money from colleagues for emergencies. Hearing this, Ryan didn't doubt me. How much do you owe? He paused and asked in a neutral tone. 3,100 yuan. Why so much? Ryan asked instinctively. The IOUs are in the tin. I can show you. I pretended to get up. Sit down. Ryan waved his hand. I don't mean to doubt you. After a long pause, he added. Can we delay repaying it for a while? I glanced at him without answering. Of course. I knew he wanted to give that money to Elena. I sneered. Keep dreaming. I was planning to head south to make a fresh start. I couldn't go without money. Chapter 7. Ryan didn't have the nerve to take the money back. He just said to leave the box with me for now. After Ryan left, I took out my father's account book, although he was overly generous. He at least had the habit of keeping records. I listed all the money he had spent on Ryan over the years. I hadn't realized how much it was until I totaled it up. Not only did my father cover Ryan's high school tuition and living expenses, but he also gave him a lot of support during college. I added it all up, 2,800 yuan in total. That was 3 years' worth of my father's salary if he didn't spend a penny. I took Ryan's 2,600 yuan out of the mooncake tin. As for the remaining 200 yuan, I considered it gone for good. I carefully hid the money, planning to return the box to Ryan the next day. What was mine, I would take with a clear conscience. What wasn't, I wouldn't touch, not even a cent. Chapter 8. When Elena showed up, I was making breakfast. The fire burned in the stove, and the white rice grains tumbled in the pot. I vaguely heard Elena's tearful voice. They're so cruel. How could they hit you? My hand paused as I scooped the rice. I walked out of the kitchen to see Elena with red, swollen eyes. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, and she was practically curled up in Ryan's arms. What are you two doing? Hearing my voice, Elena quickly turned and wiped her tears. Then she looked at me and said, Sister-in-law, don't misunderstand. It's just that I had nowhere else to go, so I came to see brother Ryan. The three of us had known each other since childhood. 10 years ago, most houses here were still made of wood, and people lived close together. Ryan and Elena grew up in the same courtyard and often played together. Later, a fire broke out, although no one was hurt. Several streets of houses were burned to the ground. After that, everyone rebuilt their homes. Later, Elena married an apprentice tailor, but he died, devastated. She barely survived and returned to her parents' home with Ryan's help. When Ryan said Elena was living under someone else's roof, he meant that after returning, she often had verbal conflicts with her sister-in-law. And every time she would come running to Ryan, Ryan always acted like he had to take care of everything. What's funny is that in my previous life, I actually believed Ryan saw Elena as a sister. Ryan's about to get married. It's not appropriate for you to throw yourself into his arms like this. Anyone watching might think you're looking to remarry. Back then, being a remarried widow didn't come with a good reputation. Even though I had no intention of going through with this engagement, I couldn't resist taking a jab at her. Elena's face changed, and she instinctively looked at Ryan. Ryan frowned and scolded me. What nonsense are you spouting? I sneered and ignored them. Returning to the kitchen to finish cooking outside, the sobbing resumed and continued for a while before finally quieting down. Chapter 9. After breakfast, I headed to the factory. I worked as a quality inspector at the MSG factory. After graduating from high school, I was assigned to this job. The factory was doing okay for now, but a few years later, when the economy took a downturn, it faced restructuring and I lost my job. Coming back this time, I already knew the factory's performance was steadily declining, although most people hadn't realized how serious the situation was. I planned to sell my position in my previous life. Those who were bold during the early stages of reform and opening up reaped the first wave of benefits. Back then, becoming a millionaire wasn't just a dream. I just needed to carefully think about who I could sell my position to after work on my way home. I instinctively wandered over to the area where Elena bought her house in my previous life. It was still an overgrown, empty lot. But just 3 years later, high-rise buildings would start springing up here, and within a decade, property prices would skyrocket. In my previous life, Elena secured her stability and wealth through this property. But in this life, without the few thousand yuan to buy the house, she was destined to miss out when I returned home. I found Ryan already there. Ryan, who usually avoided the kitchen, had surprisingly prepared several dishes. You're back. Wash your hands. Dinner will be ready soon. With someone volunteering to cook, I was more than happy to oblige. Chapter 10. Dinner was quite a feast. Meat, vegetables, and even fish. He really pulled out all the stops. Sure enough, as soon as we started eating, I noticed Ryan's hesitant expression. I kept my head down, eating my food as if I hadn't noticed. Ryan, unused to being ignored by me, wanted to start a conversation but didn't know how. At that moment, Elena showed up again. The wind outside was strong, and Ryan thoughtfully invited her in and handed her a bowl of hot tea. She sat down and immediately began thanking me cheerfully. She said she was grateful that I agreed to give her the housing quota and even lend her money to buy the house. I looked at her and pretended not to know anything. Quota? What housing quota? Elena froze, immediately looking nervous and turning to Ryan. Big brother, does sister-in-law not know about you giving me the housing quota? Ryan didn't say a word and just looked at me. Elena's eyes sparkled with triumph, though her tone remained apologetic. Oh, big brother, I know you care about me and Lucas. But this is such a big decision. You should have at least mentioned it to your future wife, even if you're not married yet. Anyway, it's your property. Oh, look at me talking too much. I'll leave now. Brother. Sister-in-law. Ryan reassured her softly. Don't worry, it's my decision. Just go home and relax. After she left, I calmly continued eating my dinner. It wasn't until I finished the last bite and stood up to leave that Ryan finally spoke. Laura. We need to talk. Chapter 11. I sat back down calmly. He hesitated before saying, Can we delay paying back your dad's debt? No. I rejected him outright. There was no room for negotiation. If he willingly handed over the money, fine. But if he insisted on taking it back to fill Elena's bottomless pit like in the previous life, I'd bring out my father's account book. In any case, now that the money was in my hands, there was no way he'd use it for Elena this time. And what's this about a housing quota? You gave a housing quota to an outsider? Ryan, what do you take me for? Something this important. Don't you think you should have at least mentioned it to me? Yes, it's true. The housing quota was his. But for such a big decision, he hadn't said a word not to mention in the previous life. He had even given away my salary to her, proving just how little I mattered to him. We don't need the housing quota right now anyway. Giving it to Elena isn't a big deal. She's living at her parents' place, constantly being mistreated by her sister-in-law. Can you really stand by and watch that? It's just a quota. It wasn't even yours to begin with. Why are you making such a fuss? I nodded. All right, so that's how it is. Fine. You're right. The housing quota isn't mine. You can give it to whoever you want. It has nothing to do with me. I stood up, not wanting to exchange another word with him, but Ryan added, "We can repay your dad's debt slowly. Elena's situation can't wait. Give me the money and I'll take it to her first." Ryan reached out his hand, speaking as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Chapter 12. I went back to my room and brought out the mooncake tin. Ryan thought I had compromised, but when he opened the lid, he saw only receipts and an account book. "What's this?" I motioned for him to take a look. Ryan's expression darkened as soon as he flipped through the first page. By the time he finished, his face was grim. "What do you mean by this?" I pulled out another notebook where I had recorded all the expenses my father had spent on him and flipped to the last page. "Over the years, you've taken 2,800 yuan from my father." Ryan took a deep breath. "Are you asking me to pay back the debt?" I nodded. "If you want to see it that way, then yes, think about it however you want. But let me be clear, you're not giving that money to Elena. According to this record, you still owe me over 200 yuan. Originally, I had intended to write off the loose change, but now I wasn't willing to let it go. You wouldn't want people talking behind my father's back even after he's gone, would you?" Ryan looked at me in disbelief. "You're really calculating everything this precisely." I smiled lightly. Even close families should keep clear accounts. This time, Ryan was speechless. "Laura, I never expected you to be so calculative. Do you still want to have the wedding next month?" Ryan actually tried to threaten me. I couldn't help it. My eyes turned red. He had always been so well behaved in front of my father, and his work performance after graduation was excellent. 2 years ago, when my father fell critically ill, he was worried no one would take care of me, so he entrusted Ryan to look after me. It was Ryan who reassured my father, promising to marry me and care for me for the rest of my life. I had never openly expressed my feelings for him before, but it was those words, and the way he stayed by my side through the painful days after my father's death that made me fall completely for him. And now, he was threatening me for Elena. I sneered. Did he really think I couldn't live without him? "If you want to call off the engagement, I'm perfectly fine with that." Ryan seemed stunned by how readily I agreed before he could react. I suddenly smiled. "Actually, if you care about her so much, you don't necessarily have to buy her a house. After all, money won't solve her problems right now." Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" I smiled. "Her sister-in-law only targets her because she thinks Elena is freeloading at home if I give her my job. She'll have a stable income and someone to look after her child. Wouldn't that be even better?" Seeing that Ryan hadn't processed my words yet, I continued. "Of course, I'm not that generous, but you can trade your housing quota for my job." Chapter 13. Ryan thought it over for 2 days before agreeing. Although Elena didn't get to buy a house, she secured a stable job with a steady income. Her troubles at home were resolved. She was happy. And the same day I got the housing quota, I spent 1,000 yuan to buy the property. I was even happier. Spending 1,000 yuan for a future worth millions? Absolutely worth it. Chapter 14. Ryan thought that by giving my job to Elena, I was simply preparing for our wedding next month. So he didn't think too much about it. But what he didn't know was, I had already bought a train ticket heading south. I was leaving tomorrow. Chapter 15. When Ryan came home, I had just finished packing all my things. "Why are you packing so much stuff?" Seeing that I hadn't made dinner, Ryan went to the kitchen and cooked 3 dishes and a soup. I stuffed my bundle into the cabinet. I had too much stuff, so I was organizing. Ryan handed me a bowl of soup, and then took out a wad of cash from his pocket. Elena just started her job. I lent her 50 yuan. "Here's 30 yuan for you." I paused for a moment but calmly accepted the 30 yuan, even though most of it went to someone else. This money was owed to my father. I took it without guilt. We ate in silence, and the atmosphere felt awkward. Ryan looked at me and cleared his throat. Don't worry, after we get married, you can stay at home and relax. I'll take care of the finances every month. You'll be in charge of this household. As he spoke, the tips of his ears turned slightly red. He even seemed a little hopeful. I sneered, so next month, you're not lending your sister more money? I couldn't resist throwing in a jab. Ryan looked at me, surprised. She has a job now. Why would I lend her more money? I was stunned. I didn't know what to say, but it didn't matter anymore. Once I left. Whether he ended up with Elena like in the previous life or married someone else, it would have nothing to do with me. Before bed, Ryan brought out a stack of wedding invitations and asked me who we should invite. I looked at the bright red invitations and lowered my head. You decide. I returned to my room and locked the door. Chapter 16. This time, I didn't take much with me, just 2 sets of clothes and my money. I sewed the cash and important items into the collar of my clothes with a needle and thread. The rest I wrapped up and stuffed into my socks under my feet. I'd rather the money stink than arrive at my destination penniless. Just as I was about to fall asleep, Ryan knocked on my door again. When I opened it, I saw him holding a sandalwood box. I raised an eyebrow in surprise. What's this? Come here. He reached out to take my hand, but I instinctively pulled away. He paused, withdrew his hand and pushed the box toward me instead. Open it and see. His eyes were filled with nervousness and hope. I took the box outside and opened it under his expectant gaze. Inside, there was a pair of silver bracelets, 2 gold rings, and a jade bangle. I looked at the items with a complicated expression. In my previous life, Ryan never gave me these things. I remembered years later, after our child had grown up. I found this box in his study and opened it out of curiosity, but he had snapped the lid shut in front of me with displeasure. These are my mother's keepsakes. They're for my future daughter-in-law. Don't touch them. Later, the jade bangle somehow ended up on Elena's wrist, so he had these things all along. What I couldn't figure out was why he was willing to give them to me in this life. I laughed bitterly to myself. Was it because I gave my job to Elena and he thought I was still useful? Was this his way of thanking me? What a pity. I didn't care. What do you think? Should I put the jade bangle on for you? Ryan blushed slightly as he picked up the bangle. I pulled my hand back. We're not married yet. It's not appropriate for me to accept these. Ryan looked uneasy at my cold demeanor. He had thought I'd be happy to receive these items. After all, they were meaningful, reserved for the daughter-in-law of the family. He never expected that someone who had always cared about him would now seem completely indifferent. Chapter 17. Laura. Is something wrong? I gave him a calm look. What could possibly be wrong? I just didn't care anymore. I didn't need any of it. I turned around. Take your things back. I closed the door again, but even until midnight, I could still hear footsteps pacing back and forth outside my door. The next morning, Ryan was already gone. I picked up my luggage and boarded the green train heading south. It was a 2-day and 1-night train ride, packed with people at every stop. Vendors crowded the platform, selling snacks, fruits, and street food. I had a window seat, and during mealtimes, I couldn't bring myself to spend money on the train's boxed meals. Instead, I bought pancakes and steamed peanuts from local vendors to fill my stomach, except for the occasional bathroom break. I hardly left my seat. When I finally left the station, I discovered that the bag in my hand and the pockets of my clothes had been slashed open. Fortunately, I had only put a few small bills in my pockets as decoys. Losing them didn't matter, but in a completely unfamiliar place. I was nearly dragged into shady motels near the station several times by aggressive touts. Without saying a word, I broke free each time and clung tightly to my bundle. Eventually, I found refuge in the hallway of a hospital. The next day, with the help of the hospital security guard, I managed to rent a room in a nearby residential building. My first job was working as a shop assistant at a wholesale market. In just 2 months, I went from knowing nothing to skillfully organizing stock and preparing orders for the customers who came to pick up goods. Gradually, I noticed that the market was saturated with stores selling clothes, shoes, and socks. The competition was fierce. Popular styles sold out quickly if shops didn't stock enough inventory. Customers who couldn't get what they wanted simply went elsewhere. But if stores overstocked and the styles didn't sell, the goods would pile up and sit unsold. My boss often faced this issue. On the surface, the shop seemed profitable, with large shipments and big sales. But in reality, the unsold inventory piled up, and at the end of the year, it was possible to end up with no profit or even a loss, despite all the hustle. I noticed many nearby stores facing similar problems. After carefully calculating my initial savings of 2,500 yuan and my wages from the past year, I made a bold decision. I approached my boss. After some negotiation, I bought the unsold inventory at an extremely low price. Chapter 18. By this time, southern cities and coastal areas had already started to develop, and stylish clothes were in high demand. In contrast, inland areas like mine still lacked trendy clothing due to long distances and poor logistics. If I could transport these clothes back before others, I knew they would sell quickly. But while I had the clothes, figuring out how to transport them was a problem. I visited several freight companies at the wholesale market, but none had routes to my city. I refused to give up. After several days of searching, I finally found one company that had routes to a neighboring city, with some pleading and an extra 300 yuan. They agreed to make an additional stop and deliver the goods directly to my city. Once the shipment was sent off, I packed my things and began my journey home. Chapter 19. This time, on my way back. The train was even more crowded since it was close to the new year, but for some reason, I no longer felt nervous like I had when I first traveled south. Even when I encountered older women fighting over seats or had the strap of my small bag cut and stolen without noticing, I didn't panic. When I finally arrived at the station, I rented a small shop on the ground floor along a busy street in our town. 4 days later, after renting a tricycle, I managed to pick up my shipment. I then started selling the goods at a street stall in high-traffic areas. After working as a salesperson for a year, I had figured out the types of customers, who had money to spend, who was picky, and who loved to bargain. I knew them all. 4 wealthy customers. I introduced high-quality, well-designed clothes. 4 picky customers. I let them try on outfits over and over without showing any impatience. 4 bargain hunters. I threw in socks and gloves as freebies, offering discounts for larger purchases. Surprisingly, these tactics often encouraged more people to buy. Since it was close to the new year, many people were shopping for clothes, and my collection was stylish and diverse. Business boomed. Even nearby shop owners came over secretly to check out my styles. Soon, I had completely sold out the clothes I brought back, along with scarves, socks, and hair accessories. Everything was nearly gone. By the end of this trip, I had earned close to 10,000 yuan. I almost became a millionaire overnight. After the new year, I didn't rush back to buy more clothes. Post-New Year was the slow season for clothing sales. Bringing back inventory then would likely result in unsold stock piling up. With my profits, I bought 5 apartments in the same neighborhood where I had purchased my first property. The rest of the money, I took south again. This time, I ventured into selling electrical appliances. Having lived through this before, I knew that weddings were starting to popularize the trend of 3 spins and 1 sound. Bicycles, sewing machines, wristwatches, and radios. No wedding could go without them. Sometimes, finding a radio even required luck or connections. Chapter 20. After more than half a year, by the end of August, I finally earned a big commission from a major order. I put all my savings and wages into buying a new batch of goods and shipped them back. This time, the products sold even faster than last year's clothes. I didn't even deal with big name brands. Yet each radio I sold earned me nearly 1,000 yuan in profit, along with the cassette tapes I brought. The radios became my best-selling items. As they say, golden September and silver October. In just those 2 months, I made a fortune. Later, I went south again and took advantage of the get married and start the new year right mentality, earning even more. Even during the new year, my business continued to thrive. By then, I had built solid connections in the southern city, along with reliable logistics. Whenever I ran out of stock, I didn't need to travel in person anymore. A phone call and a money transfer were all it took to get new products delivered in a few days. At this point, my small-scale business strategy was no longer sufficient. I rented a 3-door storefront in the busiest commercial street in addition to the store. I rented a large ground floor unit to use as a wholesale warehouse. Although wholesale didn't have the same profit margins as retail, the volume of orders made up for it. When I couldn't keep up with the workload, I hired 3 salespeople. Meanwhile, I enrolled in night classes because no matter what, I couldn't afford to lack education, right? Chapter 21. Ryan, we didn't even have a banquet for our wedding, and now you're saying you won't buy me a sewing machine. The familiar voice made me look instinctively toward the store entrance. There, I saw Elena holding Lucas's hand, confronting Ryan while trying to hold back tears. 2 years had passed, and Ryan seemed to have changed. The once cold and refined man now looked haggard, with a dark complexion. If I wasn't mistaken, I even saw strands of white hair. Noticing my gaze, Ryan instinctively looked in my direction. The moment he saw me, he froze. Laura, Elena frowned and followed his gaze. When she saw me, she flinched but quickly straightened up, puffing at her chest. Oh, isn't this Laura? What's this? Are you working here now? One of my employees was about to speak, but I gave them a look and they swallowed their words. Elena adjusted her hair and, holding on to a stiff Ryan, walked toward me. She smoothed her hair. Long time no see, Laura. I smiled. Shopping. Ryan's eyes reddened. His lips moved, but no words came out. Elena shot him a sharp glare, then turned back to me with a smile. Laura, you probably don't know yet. Ryan and I are married. I smiled. Congratulations. Are you here to buy things for the wedding? Elena nodded smugly. She then asked me to show her around the store. Under my admiring and envious gaze, she bought a radio, a sewing machine, and even a color TV. The color TV was one of my newest and most expensive items. Naturally, I added an extra 1,000 yuan to the price to celebrate our reunion. After paying, Ryan's face visibly darkened. But Elena, before leaving, couldn't resist smirking and said thank you so much for your help today. Laura, working here must be tiring, right? But I heard you get commissions too with all the things we bought today. You must have earned quite a bit. I held back my laughter. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Just as Elena was basking in her pride, a middle-aged man with a large belly hurried into the store. Boss, has my TV arrived yet? Since the man was clearly addressing me, Elena's smile froze and she turned to look at me in disbelief. I smiled and led the man toward the warehouse. Of course, I've already set it aside for you. Follow me. Chapter 22. When I stepped out of the warehouse, Ryan and Elena were already gone. That evening, I took inventory of the day's sales and balanced the books with my employees before locking up the store. I had barely taken a few steps when I noticed someone following me, reaching into my bag for the pepper spray. I froze when the person called out, Laura, it's me. It was Ryan. Chapter 23. A roadside food stall. Ryan ordered 2 bowls of stir-fried noodles. The clinking of glasses and the sound of sizzling woks filled the air with liveliness. Yet, the two of us sat in silence, because in my world, Ryan had already been erased 2 years ago. In fact, over these past 2 years, I could count on one hand the number of times I had thought about him. My focus had been solely on making money and buying property. If Ryan hadn't suddenly appeared today, I might have already forgotten what he looked like when the noodles arrived. I picked up my chopsticks and started eating. I was hungry. Meanwhile, Ryan continued staring at me with a complicated expression. Finally, after a long pause, he asked, Laura, have you been doing well these past few years? I nodded without hesitation. Very well. And I meant it, especially after leaving Ryan. I had been doing incredibly well. He stared at me intently, his expression heavy. Laura, I'm sorry. I froze mid-bite. I hadn't expected Ryan to actually acknowledge his wrongdoing. His face turned pale. I know you left without saying goodbye because you were too disappointed in me. We were engaged, yet I never cut ties with Elena. Instead, I kept helping her, but I never expected her to tell people that she was already mine. I couldn't help but laugh. So your sister turned into your girlfriend? Nice. They were never real siblings, yet he had called her sister constantly. And they were never shy about their closeness. No wonder people believed Elena when she claimed they were a couple. Ryan kept rambling. Her family caused a huge scene, demanding that I marry her. But how could my mom agree to me marrying a woman with a child? Then Elena and her family started causing trouble at my workplace and even at my mom's job. Wait, I raised my hand to stop him. I had zero interest in hearing about his mess. I set down my chopsticks. You're already married. Talking to me about this is inappropriate. Enjoy your noodles. I'm leaving. I took out 100 yuan and handed it to the stall owner before quickly making my exit. We all lived in the same area. How could I not know what Elena's family was like? They were worse than vampires. When Elena got married, her family demanded a hefty dowry but didn't even provide her with bedding for the wedding night. How could her in-laws respect her after that? Naturally, her married life turned into a disaster, and she ended up back at her parents' house. Ryan had known all of this, but blinded by his infatuation. He thought Elena was perfect. Now that he was entangled with her family, he finally realized the nightmare he was in. But too late. He could only deal with the consequences now. Chapter 24. After that, Ryan came to see me several more times. Every time. He hesitated. Every time he seemed on the verge of saying something, but stopped. He kept catching me off guard. In the end, I had enough. I invited Elena over and had her hide behind the scenes while I faced Ryan. You've been coming to see me so often lately. What exactly do you want? I asked. Ryan seemed to summon all his courage before looking up at me. Laura, do we still have a chance? I scoffed and didn't bother to hold back. You're married. And you're still trying to hit on me? No, she tricked me. I can divorce her. Ryan shot to his feet. She was already married and had a child. If she hadn't seduced me, how could I have ended up marrying her? You don't know what it's been like. Ever since I've been with her, everyone laughs at me behind my back. They say I'm a second-hand dad who gave up gold to pick up someone else's leftovers. Before he could finish, a loud voice interrupted. I'll kill you. You shameless bastard, what's wrong with having a child? Does he eat your food or carry your name? You call me leftovers? And what about you? You're nothing but a rotten cucumber. You're just all show and no substance. If I'd known you couldn't last 3 seconds, I'd rather have died than marry you. Poor amid the chaos, as insults and shouting erupted, I calmly put on my sunglasses and walked away. Life is long. Maybe their misery was only just beginning, and I was so glad I had walked away when I did.